今天的第一场演讲，讲师是来自 Insomniac Games 的首席游戏设计师 Josue Benavidez， 题目为透过团队合作来进行关卡设计。
All right. Hey, everyone. How's it going? How are all of you? Thanks for coming today or for joining us online or however you're here. Good morning. At least I think it's morning right now for everyone. I'm super excited to be here today, even though if I'm not really there, I wish I was. Taipei seems like an awesome city with some amazing architecture that I've actually looked at for reference before. I wish I could be there in person with all of you up on stage, but who knows, maybe another year. This is a little weird for me doing this from my desk. I'm, again, used to doing this on stage in front of all of you. That's a little bit more natural for me. And, there's got to be something we can do about that, right? Let me just see if I can just pull up a stage here. There we go. Awesome. All right. Let me just get up onto this stage. Great. Now all I need to do is figure out how I can get my presentation on one of these screens. And we should be, there we go. All right. Yeah. Now we're ready to go. Cool. So, I'm Josue Benavidez. I'm a lead designer at Insomniac Games, and I've been designing games for around 14 years. And over that time, I've had quite a personal journey. And part of that journey has been discovering and seeing the amazing things that can be accomplished when you work with a team of talented developers like the folks that we have at Insomniac. Today, I'm going to be talking about level design, and specifically how, as designers, we can design levels better when we work in collaboration with a team. Now, in case you're not familiar with our games, here are just a few of the games that Insomniac has made over the years. And specifically, here are the games that I've worked on at my time with Insomniac. I started my design career on Resistance: Fall of Man, working to help build the multiplayer modes. On Sunset Overdrive, I built night defense bases and defense traps. Then on Spider-Man, I worked on the initial map and layout for the city. And on each of these projects, I've had level design responsibilities, and I've refined and tuned my process for level design along the way. But just as I've grown as a designer, the industry and the landscape of games has grown as well. And so I'm here to talk about level design, but it brings us to an interesting question. What even is level design? This question is not as straightforward as it may seem. Traditionally in games 10 or 20 years ago, the geometry for a game space was directly tied one-to-one to the game objectives of that space. A level was also a mission with a specific goal in mind for the player. You didn't typically have game spaces you could explore outside of a particular mission or quest. Now, for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to consider level design from the point of view of building a space with an intended gameplay objective, because this is still true for most game spaces you design, even in open world games where an area of the world is used outside of a mission or quest. Typically, that section of open world is catered to the biggest or most important mission or quest that takes place in that area. Even though games and the concept of a level has evolved over the years, the same basic goal persists. You're still faced with the same basic design challenge, which is how do you build a game space that delivers an interactive experience that players will never forget? And that is level design. So I'm going to walk through a high-level overview of the level design process. Specifically, I'm going to cover how the design process engages with other teams at each stage of this process. As a younger designer, I felt like I had to take on and own most of this process myself. But as I became more experienced, I came to appreciate the value of humility and just admitting that I don't have all the right answers. And by opening that door, you give your team the opportunity to help drive the process along with you. Because the ultimate goal of an effective team is everyone working together to leverage their strengths to create the best possible product. So here's a quick overview of the process. In the outline phase is where you define the goals for the major features of your level. In the R&D phase, or the research and development phase, you focus on solving the major unknowns. The layout phase is where you establish the scale and bounds of the level. The gameplay phase is where you focus on wiring in the gameplay and interactive elements. Production is the peak of a level's development, where many of the other teams will start to implement their features. And then there's the testing phase, where the level stays until it ships. Now, there are many ways you can slice up the level design process, and to be honest, it rarely goes in such a linear order. More commonly, you'll go up and down through this list, back and forth through these different phases. Since we're talking about working with other teams, the phases I've outlined here correlate to when those teams technically get involved and when they are the most involved. So let's start with the outline phase. The specifics of this phase really depend on the project's team structure. But this phase is where you try to list out all the specifics of your level as best as you can before you build anything. This is the phase where you can make the biggest changes or cuts with minimal loss of work. And for each of these phases, it's always important to keep in mind the goal for the phase. And ideally, what is it that you want to accomplish by the end of the phase? So by the end of the outline phase, there's likely going to be nothing in game that's been built. But the goal for the phase should be that a designer can present an outline with all the key features of the level to the leads, the directors, and the team, and everyone agrees that the level is both exciting and achieves its goals. But in order to achieve goals, we have to first define them. Often, there's some framework that for the goals that you need to fall within. Usually, there are prerequisite goals that are given to you to build the level with. Most commonly, this comes from leads, directors, or producers. Any goals or direction you establish need to be ranked in a hierarchy so you know what takes priority over what. These goals should outline what must the experience contain. What has to happen no matter what? When players finish a level, what do they absolutely walk away with? These can be emotions, they can be narrative beats, they can be gameplay accomplishments. Defining the goals for your level will involve some of the most fundamental decisions made about the level and should be done with the project leads and directors so that you can ensure that alignment with what it is you want the level to become. Depending on how your team is built, you may have more or fewer leads or directors delivering the direction for the level. Working with your leads is crucial in early development. It's very important to be clear on the intent behind the direction and to try to establish the bounds to work within. Try to gather from directors clear examples of things that work and do not work. Direction isn't about being told what specifically to do, even if maybe sometimes it's delivered that way. Direction is about posing a challenge. It's our job as designers and developers to take direction and make the best game that we can with that direction. All of us have a particular expertise in our fields, and it's up to us to leverage that expertise to apply our crafts in a way that serves the direction best. On Spider-Man, the directors and leads were very clearly aligned on the direction for Spider-Man's New York. We wanted the iconic skylines of the city to have that larger-than-life feel. But the specifics of which buildings exactly we had, how tall the buildings were, how far apart they were, and the details of the exact layout of the city, those were things that were left up to the individual designers and programmers and artists to determine, not the leads. This phase typically sees the heaviest involvement from the narrative and creative teams. The narrative arc of a game often provides the context and setup for the setting. Usually the reason the hero is in a particular location is motivated by the story, and this is true even if you're designing a section of an open world map where there are no quests or missions. There's still a reason the hero is in the world. The hero will still have motivation for going through the world, and the inhabitants of the world will have motivations of their own that will intersect or even conflict with the hero's motivations. The narrative matters always, and you can still tell an engaging story through the environment. The world itself can be the narrator. When working with the creative teams, it's important to identify narrative beats that can be tied to or delivered through the layout or gameplay. What story is the player supposed to unveil, and how the world or level tell them? How do the world and level tell them that story? The real world we all live in has a history, and as you walk through the world, you experience that history through the impressions and the markings history leaves on the world. So as people, we're keyed into subconsciously trying to read into that history in the world around us, and many players will do the same in games. So it's important to give your level a history. It's also important to get everyone you can involved in this early phase. This gives the team a heads up on what to expect down the line. Your level goes into full production. It also opens the door to any creative insights from any other members of the team. There are many ways to get your team involved early. One way is you could hold a brainstorm where everyone can come and pitch in ideas. It's also good to sync up with key stakeholders, maybe one-on-one, to field specific concerns. I also like to do a little small pre-pitch to maybe the team that's going to be working on the level. And it's also great to get your peers involved. If you're a designer, get other designers to come in and take a look at your level and give you some feedback. So the level outline is where we sketch out the flow for our space. And we want to describe in some simple form how players will move through and experience the space. Some spaces or levels are nonlinear, so you might describe several possible flows, or it might just be a list of all the key areas of a map with no intended specific flow. Some levels are purpose-built for a mission or a series of objectives. Your outline may describe the flow of the mission as well. The point here is to keep things fluid. Lists are generally low cost and quick to write up. You can rearrange, add, remove, edit items from an outline generally much faster than you can from any other form of a level. This enables you to explore composition and make huge structural changes with relatively little or no cost. There are a lot of things that you can't make calls on from just looking at an outline. Some things you have to build to know how they work. The whole point is to make any major decisions that you can right now from just looking at the outline. Something might obviously not belong, or something might be missing, and if you can determine that in the outline, you can potentially save yourself a lot of time and resources by making those edits earlier. Sometimes you can get stuck when trying to define the outline for a level. Maybe it's unclear how gameplay will function or how the space will be composed. If I get stuck in the pitch phase, I like to take a little time to step ahead and build some very rough layouts of prototypes. This is something you can do. This is something we're going to be doing a lot more of in the next phases, but doing some previz style layout and experimentation can be a technique to move a level along that might be stalling out in the outline phase. Sometimes you just need to try out ideas to jumpstart other ideas. The point here is to not get too tied to anything you build, and don't constrain yourself. You really want to be blue sky here in this phase. Once you have a solid outline for your level, you want to pitch the level to everyone that will be involved. You can start by pitching to a small group of leads and directors to try to get their buy-in first. You might receive feedback from the leads, and so you'll want to revise and edit your outline. And then it's also important to pitch it to everyone, not just those directly involved in building the level. This casts the widest possible net. If there's something or someone on the team that might have insight on your level, you want to be able to get those ideas as early as you can. So the R&D phase, or the research and development phase, this is the phase where you start to get your hands dirty and actually start to build something in game. But the focus of this phase is not so much building the rough of your level. The purpose is really to find the boundaries of where the level needs to stay within. The level outline lists the goals that need to be achieved, but there are usually a lot of questions about how those goals are actually going to get achieved. And this is where we start to answer those questions. The goal for this phase is to have functional prototypes that demonstrate the solutions to the level's biggest unknowns and risks. Ideally, there are no major unknowns after this phase. Now, practically, that almost never happens, but again, that's the ideal. If you created a good pitch, then you should have some major risks or unknowns to solve for. I have my own personal philosophy that if your pitch doesn't scare people, then you're not pitching hard enough. This phase is more about answering unknowns and managing risk than it is about building the actual level geometry. When pitching to the level, pay attention to the reactions of the team. Try to make mental notes of any features of the level that appear to have negative reaction to the team. When talking with the team after the pitch, be on the lookout for similar topics or questions raised by multiple people. Usually, if a topic is mentioned several times, it's a topic the team is potentially worried about. Focus on addressing topics and concerns from the team first. Use the research and development phase to answer and address issues the team might have. A little bit of research can also save you a lot of work. Look for media or references that very closely achieve similar goals to what you hope to find in your level. Find examples of gameplay that demonstrate the kind of gameplay you want to build. And try to get as close as possible or call out the details that match the best. You can say things like, well, the atmosphere in this level, or the lighting here, or the layout in this thing, or the way that this specific thing plays out. At this phase, everything you build will be very, very early. So these targets help the team establish what you expect the level to look like when it's actually finished. And when you're trying to establish visual targets, it's a great time to reach out to the environment team. They often have a large knowledge base of great visual targets. So share with them references that you've found and references that represent the goals you want to achieve. And pick out the things that you think work well and other things that you would rather avoid. Any gameplay specific or unique interactions the level has should be prototyped and proven out before they're incorporated into the level. If the gameplay doesn't work out or needs to be changed in a significant way, it will have a serious impact on the level's layout. Determine what layouts work best with the gameplay that you're trying to build and prove them out here. Everything you build here should be quick and dirty, the bare minimum to get the point across. Any new or unique gameplay you want to build should be represented to the gameplay teams and their support teams, such as animation and VFX. When working with the gameplay teams, focus on the results you're trying to get and the why behind what you're trying to build and why you think it's fun. Don't focus so much on the actual feature you're trying to build, because oftentimes gameplay teams will have insights on how to do things differently. So be open to their alternative options and how to achieve the gameplay that you want. So once you have some of the bigger picture questions out of the way, it's time to start the process of actually laying out your level. Now, many years ago, this might have even started out on paper. Paper maps were at one point standard way to build levels because the actual geometry layout process used to be a lot more difficult. These days, level editing tools are quite advanced, and most designers will jump right into 3D. I still find doing some very simple sketches in 2D or on paper to be very helpful, but this is a personal preference, and you should start with whatever works best for you. The goal for this phase is players should be able to play through the entire level, but in order to get the full experience, they'll need to be guided by the designer who's sort of telling them what's happening along the way. Now, before you get too far with your first pass of the level's layout, you need to first establish scale. This means getting your biggest and your smallest spaces into 3D so you can look around at the space from your hero's perspective. Scale can sneak up on you. And early on, when there are little to no scale cues, it's easy to make an assessment of scale that is way off when you actually get into game and you have proper scale cues. Make sure to include geometry or props that provide a strong sense of scale. Usually these are things like doorways, chairs, windows, objects that are fairly common and that people interact with regularly. Even if you aren't at a point where you can run the game, you should still be able to approximate the position and field of view of the hero camera and look at your level from that perspective. This is another key point to loop an environment. When you feel confident with your scale targets, get the environment team to evaluate your scale extents. The environment team tend to be experts on scale and composition. Something that might seem in scale to a designer could present issues when an environment artist has to take that rough to final art. Improper scale is one of the most common issues I see in level development, and it's not a mistake that only new developers make. Sometimes your confidence can betray you into thinking that you can skip simple steps like these, but you can't. You need to run through the basics no matter how long you've been making levels. Before we even began building Spider-Man's New York, we started by focusing on scale. In particular, we wanted to work out the scale of all the major landmarks. One of the most vital landmarks to get right was Central Park, because it's supremely iconic. I think almost everyone has heard of Central Park or seen images of it in movies and TV. But also, if it didn't look right, players would notice, and it would be very obvious that it wasn't in scale. And if we ended up wanting to change it later, it would affect the entire city. So it was something that we focused on to make sure we got right. So before we drew even the first map, we chose the scale that would work and play best for our game, but also for Central Park. So at this point, you're going to start blocking out your level. And we call it blockout, or block in, or gray box, because you generally want to stick to very primitive shapes for your first pass. You should be primarily focused on establishing the correct scale and composition for your level. We'll get to roughing the details of the level eventually, but your first pass should be quick and dirty. You want to be able to move through the level and get an idea for how each segment of the gameplay will play out in your level. The focus for this phase is layout and not gameplay, but that being said, gameplay tends to inform the layout. During your early blockout, you may want to set up some very early gameplay to help evaluate the space. This could be putting in just a few enemies without some complex logic or behavior. Just give players something very simple to fight and understand how the space will play. Now, I want to talk about mood for just a little bit. When it comes to level design, mood can have different interpretations. When I think of mood, I'm thinking about the emotional impact the level has on the player. What are the feelings I'm trying to trigger on the player? Practically, this means what is the level's atmosphere, what's the lighting, the tone, what's the audioscape of the level. I've seen different designers represent the mood at different points in the level design process, and I don't think there's any one right answer. I've seen levels that have no representation of mood until the post-production phase, where all the art comes in. But personally, in my process, I like to establish mood very early on, even in blockout, before I'm done refining the geometry. Mood can have significant impact on the perception of scale or the path in which the player flows through the level. Now, the risk here is that mood can be tricky to get right and can mislead as much as it informs. And it's not always something that designers are experts at. That's why I think it's important to get support from the teams that will be responsible for the level's lighting and atmosphere and audio. Ask if there's anything rough or simple that you can use that will fit the right mood for the level. So the first time that I had ever really considered the emotional impact of the level was back on Resistance 3. I was working on a multiplayer level with one of our senior artists, Craig Goodman. Now, sadly, Craig passed a few years ago, but I'll never forget how he impacted and changed the way that I think about levels and environment art. He was asking me what I wanted in the level, and I told him all about the layout changes and the sightline issues and the spine issues that we're having. And he had stopped me and just said, no, I want to know how you think it should feel. And I was shocked by this question because I had never considered it, and I had to take a moment to think about it. And when I finally thought about it hard, I said, sad. It should feel sad. And Craig told me that that was perfect. And then from there, so much about the level started to come together. Everything started to fall in line after that. The mood aligned us and aligned the level. And that's also a perfect example of how powerful collaboration can be. So once you have your first pass of the blockout, you should still, you'll have the earliest representation of what the level is in whole. And this is the phase that you want to do your most extreme geometry edits. At this point, the level should be built out enough that you can evaluate flow, pacing, and the sequence of level. This is also a good point to run through the level with everyone who will be working on it, and so that you guys can evaluate and decide where changes need to be made. Once you're confident with level blockout, you'll need to start prepping the level to support gameplay. This generally means smoothing out a lot of rough edges. The blockout process is quick and dirty, but generally for gameplay to function, you'll need geometry to be more refined within metric and snap to the grid. This is where you go through your level and clean up any spaces that have been pushed outside of metric. The gameplay phase is mostly about implementing gameplay in the level, but it will inevitably involve a fair bit of layout work as well. Up until this point, we've made the best choices we could to get the level as close as we could before implementing all the gameplay scripting and markup. This gameplay implementation tends to take longer and is less agile. So this is why we've held off on doing the heavy gameplay implementing until now. Now the level will take its final shape and it'll start to play the way we intend. By the end of this phase, you should be able to hand control over to another player and they should receive the full gameplay experience of the level while playing on their own. The actual visual and audio experience, however, will still be in a rough phase. So wiring up the level can have a wide range of meanings and it really depends on the projects. It often involves scripting a level with some kind of scripting language, which might be a visual script or a code-based script. In either case, this is where you focus on adding all the interactive features of your level. Even though the level probably still looks very rough, it should still start to play the way it's intended. Stay agile in this phase. The level is starting to tighten down, and you may feel adverse to major changes that will have big impact on the level. You may want to instead noodle on smaller tweaks and nudges to the gameplay when all the features, and it is true that when all the features of a gameplay get implemented, it will feel better. But at its core, if it's not fun now, it will probably still won't be fun even after everything else has gone in. Think of approaching gameplay in the same way you would approach the blockout. Details will be clearer as you move from blockout to fully arted layout, but no amount of art or detail will fix a left turn where a right turn is needed. So just as you would make significant changes to the blockout to fix crucial layout issues, you need to also be prepared to make significant gameplay changes if the experience is not delivering on your goals. Take broad strokes at first. Don't be afraid to go outside your comfort zone. Often gameplay iteration fails because the changes are too safe. Any gameplay features that are new or being built specifically for the level will need a fair amount of attention from the gameplay teams. Try to set up examples or test cases for new features that can be loaded directly into so that those gameplay teams can test. This just makes the process easier for the gameplay teams and support teams like animation and VFX to load up a feature and test it out without having to play through the whole level first. In an ideal world, we'd have a fully wired and rough level before the environment team had to start on their production. However, the realities of schedules and deadlines in production means that we may need to all start working simultaneously. This is where it's key to coordinate with your team. Hand off parts of the level to the environment. Let the team know which areas of the level are less likely to change or have the most resolved gameplay. As gameplay features start to come online and parts of the level are playing as intended, start running small-scale tests. This could be having a player or two run through just one segment of a level. This is another great opportunity to involve your team. Take someone who will be supporting the level and have them play through this section. Not only will you get insights from different disciplines, but your team will have a better understanding of the challenges you're trying to solve. During this phase, the level layout may have shifted around to support the changes and updates to gameplay. You may have feedback notes from earlier testing that could impact the layout of the level. After your gameplay pass is complete and you've done some early testing, try to make any significant layout changes before the environment team starts on their pass. Most teams have a concept that's called something like geo-lock or level lock for the rough. It's sort of like last call for changes to the rough. In my experience, this is the moment when as soon as you say something is level locked, it'll need to be changed. So I like to just think of it as after this, only critical changes will be made to the level. So we only change the level after this if absolutely necessary. The production phase is the all hands on deck phase. This is where most of the other teams will start their phases of start working on the level, and this is where the level starts to take its final form. This phase is where coordination and communication become most vital. There are going to be a lot of moving parts and changes coming on top of each other. One of a designer's primary responsibilities during this phase is to help orchestrate the incoming changes to minimize blockage. The goal for this phase is for players to get the full experience of the level when they play through it. In this phase, the designer's responsibilities shift somewhat from a core implementer to more of a support role for the other teams. There are still many design tasks to accomplish, so this will need to be balanced with supporting the team. The priority is to keep everyone unblocked. A task you can complete on your own may not be as high priority as a task that another team member is waiting on in order to move forward. This phase can be wild. Many features and changes will be going into the level at rapid pace. It's common for things to break when changes are coming in all at once. Even so, it's vital to keep the level functioning because the number of individuals that may need to work on the level could be quite high at this point. Often features can't be implemented if they can't be tested and verified. So a non-functioning level may inhibit workflow. Non-functioning levels also reduce visibility across the team. If a level can't be played through, then people may stop reviewing and scrutinizing their work within it. One of the biggest hurdles we face as developers is playing the game while we are in the heat of production. Non-functioning levels just make this challenge even harder. So even if you have to set up a temp fix to bypass something that's being actively worked on, you should go and do everything you can to keep a level functioning. This phase is where the gameplay will continue to be tuned and tweaked. Before in the gameplay phase, we focused on broad stroke changes to define the direction of our gameplay. In this phase, we fine-tune changes, and our changes become smaller tweaks that we test and iterate on over and over again. It's also really important in this stage to think about how players could break your gameplay. It's very tempting to just play through your level as you intend for the experience to flow, but often players are far more unpredictable than that. You should know better than anyone how to break your own level. If you know how it could break, and if you could do it on purpose, then players will inevitably break it on accident in the exact same way. So don't just play it the way it's meant to be played. Play it like you're trying to break it. Another temptation is to solve problems all by ourselves, especially if these are problems that we created. With all the tools at our disposal in modern engines, it's even more tempting to try and create our own fixes. But before you start down the road to a complicated solution to some of your problems, you need to step back and consider if the problem would be better solved by another team member. Everyone on the team is generally very busy, so it can be hard to ask someone else to fix a problem that you created. But many times the solution a programmer or an artist will implement is much more elegant and reliable than something hacked together in script. And at the very least, you can always ask if someone has a better solution. And if they don't, you can always fall back to doing it yourself. One thing that's vital at this stage is to periodically get together with your team and run through the level. Do this as often as your schedule can accommodate. Sometimes levels are too big to get through in a single sitting, so run through it in different parts at a time. Playing the level together as a group just makes issues extra clear when you can all see them as they're happening. It also allows for individual work to shine and serve as inspiration. Plus, it reminds you that you are a team. So generally speaking, this is the final phase of a level's life cycle. Every project is different, and levels can go back and forth through the various phases or sections, and sections of them can go back into the drawing board even. Most likely, a level's path to final will not be this linear and this sequenced. There are many types of testing, and you will have likely started some of this testing long before this phase. I'll be going over the different types of testing in brief, just so that you know what to expect. But just know that you'll probably have been doing this all along. The point of this phase, though, is this is just the phase where the entire focus of the level process becomes around solving and fixing bugs. So the ultimate goal for this phase is the ultimate goal of every level, and that's that players can play through a level and get the full experience of every feature without hitting any bugs. So QA testing is one that most people are probably the most familiar with. When your level crashes the game or players fall out of the world, usually QA is the first to let you know. QA will have likely been testing the level long before this phase, but this is the phase where QA goes gloves off. Before now, certain parts of the level may not have been ready for full testing, or features were still a work in progress. At this point, everything is fair game to be tested. Open a line of communication with your testing team. Sometimes the testing team is offsite, which can make communication difficult. So you need to find a means to establish a back and forth. Also, ask the testing teams if there's any way that you can provide, anything that you can provide to them that will help them with their tests. Then discuss your concerns with QA. You may know about things that you're worried about or things that you may think might break. And so it's good to give them a heads up because they can also do a first pass and let you know and either validate or give you feedback on how you can proof the level against it breaking. I think it's also important to note here that everyone is part of a team. Now, different companies and projects have different team culture, but something that tends to happen with the QA team more than other teams is a sense of exclusion from the development process. I actually started my career in video games as a QA tester. And one of the things about Insomniac specifically that I appreciated was how inclusive the projects were with regards to the QA team. On every project I ever worked on in Insomniac, even as a QA tester, I always felt like I was part of the team. And because I felt like a real part of the team, I was invested in the projects I tested. So invested, in fact, that I've been at Insomniac for more than 14 years. And I would like to think that I've contributed back to the projects in some very meaningful ways. And so that's the value of inclusion on the team. So user testing is a different paradigm from QA testing. User testing is a kind of sneak peek at how real players will engage with your level. Usually user tests are conducted by teams specifically trained for user tests. User tests can provide your team with answers, but only if you can provide the user testing team with appropriate questions. And this is harder than it may seem. Ultimately, you want to know if the level is fun and if you're getting the goals across. But you can't just ask that on a questionnaire and get data that you can act on, particularly if it's a large test with dozens of users. Luckily, the user testing teams are pretty good at helping you define and structure the test objectives. It's important to break into specifics the kind of information you'd like to gather, and also define how the data you gather will influence decisions or changes you make. Don't just throw questions out there if there's nothing you can really do with the answers. So accessibility is an entire talk on its own, and I'm only going to cover it in very brief here. Accessibility means making your level and gameplay as usable by as many people as possible. Now, often you will see accessibility framed around support for players with disabilities or special needs, but I think that perspective is far too narrow. All people have varying strengths and weaknesses and interface with the world at different levels of capacity. We consider accessibility in every game we make. In fact, we consider accessibility for all of you as well. There are certain button combos we avoid because they are too difficult for most players to do. When we update a UI element on the screen, oftentimes we have to play a little sound or chime because players won't notice it unless we have a little sound letting you know that it's popped up. So everyone needs a little bit of help and a little assistance. Modern games are very taxing, both mentally and physically. They strain our eyes, our ears, our dexterity, and our concentration. Making your game or level more accessible improves the experience for all players. Hopefully, there will be individuals on your team that are experts or at least very passionate about accessibility. Seek out their feedback, specifically regarding the accessibility of your level. User teams are often consider accessibility quite a bit as part of their tests as well, so use them. If there are no accessibility points of contact in your team, consider being a champion for accessibility. Maybe your project would be willing to invite an outside expert or consultant to evaluate accessibility. Again, don't just consider accessibility as something that will improve the experience for a few select groups of players. Improving accessibility of your level improves it for everyone because everyone needs some form of assistance. So this is a more informal test. This is a practical test. And this one is optional, but it's good to do if you have the opportunity to do it. When we make games, we almost always do so in an office setting. This past year has changed that for quite a lot of people, but even those working from home probably aren't doing it from the couch of their living room. They're probably doing it from a desk, much like the one they would have at work or at the office. If you have the opportunity, and if your project permits, try to play your level from a more natural setting, like from the couch in your living room. If you're developing a PC game, then the natural setting may be something more like a desk in front of a screen, but more and more PC games support controllers in a home theater type setup. Now, to be honest, you may not learn a lot from this test. Any issues that you do encounter probably are going to be minor. And this test is mostly just for you, since it gives you a final perspective of how players will experience your level. Your spooky nighttime level might be more impactful when you're alone in a dark room than when you are sitting at a desk in a well-lit office full of coworkers. And this just allows you to play through it like your players would. So all this testing will generate mountains of bugs, but it'll also leave you with a large amount of feedback. Feedback can be tricky to deal with, and actually be harder to deal with than bugs, because you and your team will have to make a call on how to address the feedback or whether to address it at all. You should collaborate with your level team even when it comes to feedback. Ask for potential solutions and discuss options. When you evaluate feedback, keep your goals in mind. Ask whether or not accommodating a piece of feedback would help the level achieve its goals more or less. So also it's important to note that changes at these final stages of development tend to be the most costly. Even if a change will make a clear and marked improvement on a level, you have to weigh the cost versus benefit. If the cost is low and the benefit is high, then it's an easier call to make. But often the cost versus benefit evaluation is harder to resolve. When you propose changes to your team, frame it in a way that asks them to make their own evaluation. If you and your team do not agree on the cost versus benefit, then it may be necessary to bring an outside perspective, maybe someone from another team, or possibly even the project's leadership. Late changes tend to be what cause the most friction between teams. Changes at this stage are particularly delicate and should be handled with care and respect. Changes at this point mean extra work for the team, and likely late nights. Empathy and compassion are key skills here, and sometimes you have to choose to do what's best for your team and not what's best for the level. So that was my talk about the phases of design and building levels as a team. So just to recap, we start with the outline phase, where we define our goals and pitch the level to our team. Then we have the R&D phase, or the research and development phase, where we try to resolve the major unknowns and top concerns from the team. Next, we move on to the layout phase, where we build a quick and dirty blockout, verify scale and composition, and check this with the environment team. After that, we have the gameplay phase, where we set up the game mechanics and make sure that our team can easily test gameplay features. Then in the production phase, we continue to refine gameplay while switching over to more of a support role for all the rest of our teams as they shift into full feature implementation. And then finally, we have the testing phase, where we try to deliver a bug-free level while also balancing feedback and the well-being of our team. Now, just remember, it's easy to get tunnel vision on a project and feel like your level is the most important thing you built, but it's not. Your team is the most important thing you build, because without your team, you can't make a level. And that's why our goal is not to design levels as individuals, but to design them as a team. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming today or watching online. I had a lot of fun giving this talk. I hope you learned something, or at least enjoyed it a little bit. Now, I believe I will be taking questions in some form of chat. I should be there to answer them live for you. So I'll see you in chat if I'm there. And if not, thanks anyone. And I hope you all have a great rest of your conference. Bye.
第二轨第一场的这个演讲哦，那是由我们的Josue Benavidez 然后来带给我们这么精彩的演讲。那我们现在也有讲师直接从国外连进来的 Live Q&A， 那就请大家赶快使用这个 Slido 的连结来把你的问题提出来。好，那我们已经有一些问题已经提进来了，我们就会直接进行 Q&A 的部分。Okay, so thank you very much, Josue, for the talk.
Yeah, thanks. That was a lot of fun.
Okay, so let's jump right into the Q&A part because I think we will have a lot of questions. So the first question I see is during the production phase. You mentioned like in the latter half of the talk. In production phase, does every team member still have the capacity to like raise concerns or like try to submit changes to the levels? And so how do you manage that process? Who has the authority to actually decide on whose feedback I want to take in, and then who's going to be responsible for that change?
Right. So, I mean, yes, sometimes the production phase is when we get the most concerns raised, because that's when the most amount of work is going in.
Yeah.
And so, ideally, the responsibility is on the team. We try to work together as a team. Like, okay, well, and that's the importance of goals and like setting goals, because if you all agree on the goal, hey, we want to do this big thing for the level. When you run into problems, it's not about the designer saying, well, I want this. It's about us going, okay, how can we still do what we wanted to do, right? And so like the best case scenario is the team, we work out, okay, how do we make the changes that still give us the best game, right? Then sometimes, we have to take priorities into account, or we may need to ask or go to our directors, right? If we're like, hey, we have a big issue, it may mean making some sacrifices, and we need some guidance on what things we want to sacrifice. And so that's when you might go to your directors to get their perspective. But ultimately, hopefully, it's a group effort on the team making that decision together.
I see. So I'll do a translation here.
Yeah.
那讲师的回应对于刚刚这个问题呢，就是说每个团队成员是否在就是 production phase 的时候都还有机会提出关卡的修正的质疑或是一些意见哦。那如果有的话，谁来决定？谁来做这个最终的负责任的动作？那讲师的回应是说，基本上你还是会希望以整个团队一起来做这个决定，大家要有共识才行。那有这个共识的前提，其实就是说你的团队应该要有一个明确的目标，就是为什么你要这样修改，并不是只是说谁要提出修改要做什么，就是只是提出修改的执行的内容，而是说有没有这个修改的真正想要达到的目的。那这个目的应该要有全部的团队成员一起来有一个共识决。那如果真的有一些非常难以决定的事情，你需要比较高层的指引的话，那也许那个时候你会去问总监、制作人之类的，那时候是由他们来做这个最后的决策。那大概简单翻译这样子。Okay, so probably missed a little bit nuance there, but I think I got most things across.
Sure.
Okay, and so another question is, I think you talk about this in the speech already, but there's a question about during all these phases, like 6 different phases of the level design, generally how much time is spent on like each phase? Can you give a ballpark idea about that?
It's difficult because it's very different for each type of thing you build. Sometimes you can move very quickly and get to building really quickly if you have a lot of confidence and good knowledge about what you're doing already. And it depends on the complexity. A really complicated thing, like for example, the city, the city I'm at, New York City, we spent a lot of time on layout in the early phases to make sure we got it right, more so than we would normally for a level, right? And so it's sort of difficult, but generally very high level. Time investment gets bigger as you get closer to production. So production's the biggest chunk generally of time investment because that's where all the work basically has to be done, right? And then you have smaller chunks before that. But sometimes for really complicated things, you need to do a lot more work ahead of time to make sure that you spend all that time on as many of the right things as you can.
Okay, so I'll translate that.
Yep.
就是刚刚这个问题是说，每一个设计阶段大概都会需要多少时间在执行这样，因为有讲师提到大概6个不同的阶段。好，那基本上在整个6个阶段一起纵观来看的话，通常都是越后面的阶段，平均来说会花费越多的时间。譬如说你在量产 production 阶段那边基本上是最花时间的。那但是每个专案的复杂度还有做法执行方式可能都不太一样，所以这个其实非常难有一个很一致的标准。那像讲师刚刚提到，他以就是蜘蛛人的这个纽约曼哈顿来做举例的话，就是说为了要尽量避免花太多时间在最后的量产阶段还改东改西，那其实蜘蛛人的曼哈顿的关卡设计基本上就是花了非常多的时间在所谓的 layout 的那个阶段，那把很多很复杂的东西都要在那边先想办法解决掉，那后来进量产进 production 之后，就是才可以比较顺利，不会遇到太严重的改动。Yep. Okay. The next question. Yeah, I'm trying to see what's on the screen. Sorry. Okay, so this question is a little bit more about how smaller teams or indie teams do level design. So for like a small team, maybe the whole team is just 1 to 3 people,
right.
And small teams like or like indie games, when they are already into like production phase, they would still have a lot of like back and forth in terms of like game mechanics or like the game content. And do you think that in terms of level design, the mindset of doing level design would be different from like a bigger from a the small team would be different from the bigger team like that, or do you think there are a lot of like things that actually the things actually share between big team and small team?
So in full disclosure, I've never worked on an indie game, on a small indie game team, even though Insomniac was independent for a long time and weren't as big as some other companies. I think Insomniac has always been kind of considered non-indie scale, even though we were independent. That being said, I feel like it's actually the same, to be honest. That comes from a perspective of I have worked on features just by myself, where I was responsible for a feature entirely. And in that way, it kind of feels like I'm an indie team within a bigger team, right? And in a lot of those cases, that's actually where a lot of this process and this philosophy comes from. It's kind of the same. It sort of scales. I had a similar talk where I talked about how the process I used to design the layout for Manhattan was exactly the same as the process I used to design little bases in Sunset Overdrive. It's all about 4 principles. and trying to basically design with intent. And also, you go back and forth through the process. And so, even on levels and level design in AAA games, you kind of do go back and forth, and you do try out other things. And so, it's not. So my guess would be, not having worked on both to say for sure, my guess would be it would actually be very similar.
I see. OK， 所以刚刚这个问题是关于，就有人问到说，小团队跟大型团队的这种制作上，在关卡设计上面，就是到后期阶段，或者说整个游戏开发的整个关卡设计开发的过程中，它在内容跟调整的思维上面，会不会有什么大小团队的差异这样子？那讲师的回应其实是说，他基本上没有在真的很小的团队工作过，所以他其实很难讲说小团队的关卡设计的状况。那只是说，以他个人的经验来讲，他觉得其实关卡设计的这整个流程，应该其实在不同团队的规模是没有太大的差异的。那他自己有举一个例子是，他其实有在另外一场演讲讲到这个就是 Sunset Overdrive 这款游戏，它在里面有蛮多地方是他必须要自己一个人独立把一整个区域设计完成。那个区域也许是很小，但是像那种情况下，它就有点像是说它是一个独立团队工作，但是是在一个比较大的团队的情境底下，它是等于是嵌在里面的一个独立小团队。那他设计那个就是 Sunset Overdrive 里面的那个小区域的流程，跟他后来在蜘蛛人设计曼哈顿的流程，其实大体上来说是一样的。那都会有遇到很多，就是你可能就是在阶段中会不停的反复修改，或者说到量产之后才发现要改动的东西会出现。那这个其实他自己觉得应该是不会有太大的差异，应该方法论是接近的。OK， Okay, so next question. Could you share an example of making essential changes at the last phase? Like, why did the team fail to find that out beforehand, and what was the result? Many thanks.
Yeah, I mean, there's the that hindsight is 2020 is perfectly applicable to game design. That's for sure.
Okay.
In terms of level design, I actually have a better example that I've shared from Spider-Man when it comes to suit powers. So suit powers is an ability in the first Spider-Man where some of the suits had special features or functions. And that was an idea that we played around with for a while. But we were worried about whether or not we really needed it because we had a lot of game and a lot of content. And so we decided to leave it out, but we got a lot of feedback from players who really wanted the suits to do things. So we ended up adding that in a little bit later than the other feature. And it was sort of a little bit last minute. And so I don't think there's always a particular answer for why you don't catch those things. Sometimes it could be you didn't follow the process or you didn't follow your process thoroughly enough. Sometimes you don't know what the cake's going to taste like until you bake it sometimes. And so that's why for me, I always like to go, well, what can we do? Can we fix it somehow? And so I have a little bit of a maybe bad reputation of trying to do that last change at the last second. Now I know what I need to do, right?
I see. OK， 所以刚刚的问题是，就是说，有人请讲师给一个就是具体的案例说，有没有哪些关卡设计上的这种重要修改是在最后才被加进去？然后，那这种具体的案例，它是怎么样？就是说，在前面的几阶段没有被找到，然后在最后面才被迫需要做这种修改。那后来结果怎样？这样？那讲师的回答其实是他说他刚刚不是用关卡设计的面向来举例，他是用这个就是蜘蛛人里面的角色能力的部分来做举例。就是蜘蛛人里面有 就是它的那个蜘蛛套装是有不同能力的。好，那这个东西其实在一开始的时候，他们并没有拿定主意说到底该怎么做，然后其实就是有点像是说，也许他们一开始并不想把那么多要素放进游戏里面，啊，所以就这个东西就有点拖着没有定案这样。那可是到很后来，就是大家各种试玩的意见之后，会发现说，哎，不对，这个东西应该要放进去。好，那其实这个也很难讲说到底为什么会这样发生，就是它并不见得是一个前期就一定能被某一种流程或程序找出来的一个就是应该要被发现的事情。好，那有时候可能就是真的到最后的时候，你才突然间发现，哎，这东西应该要加，那为什么当初没有做？那这种时候比较多时候就是只能硬着头皮上这样。对，那他是说，就是讲者本人是自嘲说，就是他自己也是常常被别人有点抱怨说，就是他很多修改都是在最后才做这样子。对，那这可能就是偶尔还是会发生的情况，啊，算是正常现象。Okay, let me go to other questions. Okay, so this question is, I think, a little bit more straightforward. So the question is, when you're designing layout or like doing the layout phase, what kind of tool or software did you use to do the layout?
Yeah, I mean, I mostly for for paper maps, I'll use a program like Illustrator, or even just drawing on pencil and paper.
Mm-hmm.
For 3D layout, usually I'll use our level editor. We have a level editor that's built in house, but it's not very different from like Unreal Editor, right? So I'll use, and again, in the layout phase, it's all simple shapes. It's square, it's cubes and cylinders, mostly cubes, right? And so we'll use that generally to begin with. If I'm making something with a really complicated shape, I will also jump into Maya or a 3D editor, a 3D modeling software, and model something. If I know it's like, okay, I can't get this with cubes, and it's really important to do this sort of natural terrain or something, I'll do that. So I use a variety. Generally, the layout phase is pretty simple. You can get by with pretty much anything.
I see. 所以讲师的回应是，就是他在做 layout 设计的时候，其实并不会限制自己用怎样的软体。他其实如果是就是单纯的就是纸笔的平面图的话，他可能单纯是用就是铅笔，然后纸就直接画。那像这种平面图，当然你也可以进，比如说 Illustrator 之类的软体去制作这个平面图。那如果是要 3D 的话，当然也是可能会用到像类似 Maya 之类的软体。但重点是这个阶段，不管你用什么软体做，或是用什么工具去做这个 layout， 它应该都是非常非常简单的，就是比如方框，然后圆形、柱状体之类的这样的东西。好，那总之就是其实并没有一个很特定的工具就是去一体适用，那就是看当时的状况。我的讲师刚刚也有提到，就是说他们自己也有这个 in house， 就是他们公司内部自己开发的关卡编辑器。那这个关卡编辑器其实长得跟 Unreal 是蛮像的那就是像这种东西，其实大概都是会他们会用到的工具。Okay, so I actually have a kind of a follow-up question from that, like about the tools. So, how important do you think the in-house like editor or tool support is for level designer during the whole process?
I mean, it's the main tool you use, so it becomes, generally speaking, so it becomes maybe your most important tool. But in terms of, I guess there's different ways to interpret the question. In terms of like how important it is to have a particular tool or that tool to do level design, I think you can do level design with anything. I've literally done it with boxes in the world, especially with Spider-Man. I've had cardboard boxes. I brought cardboard boxes to a meeting. I'm not even joking. I brought them to a meeting, and I had Spider-Man. I was like, woo, and explain how things are going, right? And so, in terms of what do you need to be a level designer? You don't need anything. You could just find boxes or Legos or paper, and you could do it. And I think you could still make effective designs that way. But yeah, in terms of what's an important tool to designers, what a designer is using most of the time, day to day, they're using the level editor, whatever the level editor is. They use that the most.
Okay, thank you very much. 对，那我刚刚补问的一个问题是说，就是像那种公司内如果有团队可以帮忙开发关卡工具的话，那这种关卡工具对关卡设计师的重要性大概如何？那就是江哲刚回答是说，就是当然如果有关卡有这样子，就是你们团队或者你们公司专属的关卡工具的话，那一定是最重要，就是一定是关卡开发者关卡设计师最重要的工具。那但是只是说也不需要被这种东西限制，就是他刚刚有一个很生动的举例，就是他其实也可以就是单纯用纸箱来做这个关卡概念开发或是关卡概念设计一个很基本的工具。那他说他就有直接把一堆纸箱带进一个他们公司内部团队的讨论会上，然后就纸箱，然后就找一个譬如说像蜘蛛人的模型，然后就展示蜘蛛人如何在这些纸箱间荡来荡去。对，就是其实这样子也是可以做关卡设计的。好，那就代表说，其实你关卡设计师并不需要被工具局限，而是说你能够想到怎样的方法，你都应该可以去使用。Okay, let's see if there are any more audience questions. Okay, I think this would be a good question to end on. Because this is kind of a broader and like question. So during your like level design career, like you have been doing this like for tens of years, and what would you be what would be considered your like most or like the biggest setback when you are doing level design, and how did you face that? How did you approach it and solve it?
That's a really good question. I mean, the honest answer is my biggest setbacks were earlier in my career when I was, wasn't as experienced, right? I once tried to make a level that was themed around Times Square, but I didn't have a strong sense of how to convert space like that into something that was usable for the game.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the end, I did a lot of additional work and massaged it. I made a lot of changes to the point where it wasn't Times Square anymore.
Okay.
It was just a street. And so, and this was like a hard moment for me because I literally had a moment where I had to rename the level because it was originally Times Square, and I had to rename it a different name because it no longer looked like Times Square. And that was like a very hard emotional moment for me. I was like, wow, I have now needed to change the name because I did not hit this at all. I named it to like Broadway or something generic because it was just a street basically. And honestly, from that though is when I started to, but it was like the greatest setback, but it's also what I think on my best course. Because from there I was like, okay, I don't want to do that again, right? I want to like be better at this. And so that's honestly where I started laying down a lot of these rules that I talked about today. I just started, okay, I'm never going to do this again, or I'm always going to do this, or I'm always going to check my references. I started just creating rules for myself. Don't do this, don't do this, do that. And it started out as a long list of rules. And eventually I was like, these are like maybe helpful to other people. I was really more thinking my team at first. So I was like, maybe this is helpful for my team. So I started posting my rules. Then I started trying to forming it into like a process because I was like, well, this doesn't work for levels. This also works for other types of design, mechanics or guns or whatever. And so I was like, well, and then so it evolved from there. So it was a pretty big setback. But again, like it's important to have those stumbling blocks, I think, early on, because they keep you aware of your shortcomings, right? And even today, I always try to make sure I follow my own rules I've set for myself, because you never really get to the point where, you're beyond making a mistake. No matter how long you've been doing it, no matter how many of these games you make, you can still make simple, stupid mistakes. And so I always like keep that in mind and try to make sure that I never have to rename a level ever again because I didn't do it right.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a very very good answer to end on. So I'll translate that. 就是刚刚最后一个，我想要就是在那个听众问题里面最后一个我想要问的问题就是说，就是江浙本人在他的这个关卡设计的生涯中遇到最大的挫折是什么？然后后来怎么解决它？这样，对，那江浙的回答是说，就是他在关卡设计生涯很早期的时候，他有想办法去做就是以就是时代广场为这个目标去设计一个关卡要放到游戏里面，然后但是他后来就是发现太多地方都就是没有办法达成他原本想要的目标，然后他就一直改，所以他一面做一面改，然后到最后就发现说他改完之后，那个时代广场就变成只剩下一条街这样子，就是本来是时代广场，然后后来他很被迫的要去把那个关卡名称改成叫一个比如说 Broadway 百老汇街这样子。对，那就是你一个关卡本来一开始是有一个参考，有一个目标想要达成，然后到最后你连关卡名称都必须改掉。他说那个时候他就真的看到这种情况，他自己就是有一个很大的警惕，说，就是为什么关卡会设计成这样？然后后来他才开始从这样的过程中去学习，说，我这个不应该做，那个不应该做，然后把一条一条规则设立下来。那这些关卡设立下来之后，才发现说，其实这些规则也对可能团队里面其他的设计师有帮助，他就整理起来，类似像今天给的这种演讲的资料，然后就在团队里面跟别人分享，然后后来发现这些东西整理起来之后，就以后就对其他的关卡设计师，对其他的关卡设计师或是其他方面的设计师，其实都很有帮助，比如什么武器设计啊，或是敌人设计之类的，也都可以用类似的流程去执行。那他现在每次在做自己的新的关卡设计的时候，也都还是一样非常的小心谨慎的去检查有没有犯过自己设下来的一些规定规则。那因为你不管就是其实演讲里面有提到很多次，你不管多资深，你还是有可能会犯一些非常非常低级愚蠢的错误。那这个是你做多久都还是要就是随时小心警惕自己的。那他觉得这个虽然也许听起来不是一个什么很厉害的事件，但是他发现说经过这样的事件，他把自己的关卡设计的一些概念就是导向了正途，然后他以设计师的身份就是实力就越来越强，慢慢培植上去。所以其实他觉得像这样子的过程对他来说也是蛮重要的经验。这样好，那因为时间的关系，我们就是大概要进入休息时间了。那如果还有其他问题的话，就是其实大家也可以就是再留在那个 slide 上面。那如果我还有机会的话，我可能可以另外再把这些问题再提供给讲师，然后看有没有机会再帮大家回答。好，那请大家就是在荧幕前面做这个虚拟掌声哦，就是感谢今天这个讲师的莅临，然后精彩的演讲跟这些回答。好，谢谢。Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun. Great. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Hey, thank you very much. And hope you have a good night, a good evening, and then we'll see you sometime in the future. Hopefully you can come to Taipei, next year or sometime.
Yeah, can't wait. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.